Thank you for being here. We like to use the microphones. You're probably thinking, wow, this is such an intimate gathering. Do we actually need the microphones?
Yeah.
We've actually found that it's very helpful to have the microphones just to amplify the sound a wee bit. And we also use it for the camera. We are recording this event, so we like to have that clarity. The microphone certainly helps with that. I'd like to welcome you all to the American Foreign Service Association. My name is Ian Houston. I'm the Executive Director of AFSA. We've seen many of you here before. We welcome you back. Some of you may be here for the first time. Welcome to AFSA. We have these events on a regular basis. We're very privileged to have, as part of our AFSA Book Notes program, this wonderful book here, China Hand. A really quite an intimate portrait of a great, great American. I think it is appropriate, just before I jump into very informally introducing our guests here, that I do say a couple of words about John Davies. He is with us, of course, in spirit. And in fact, Tiki, I think you even have a stamp. If you want signatures on the book, if you purchase the book, Tiki has a
I have
stamp.
his Chinese chalk.
Nice.
Well, I with me since he can't sign, so I figured I'd let you all have that one instead.
George Kennan once said of John Davies, he was one of the finest observers of Oriental countries that we, and we, I have in parentheses, we being the U.S., ever had. And he truly was a man of integrity. We throw that word around a little bit lately, but this truly was a man who had deep integrity. He was a patriot. I think we honor him with this program, and we honor his memory and his loyalty to his country. And as an organization representing the men and women of the Foreign Service, that same integrity, that same patriotism still exists. And the men and women of the Foreign Service are representing our country proudly, and we honor them. AFSA honors them each day, and we honor them with this program. Very informally, let me introduce our guests. I'd like to first introduce Patricia, Tiki Davies. You go by Tiki.
Yes.
Tiki is one of 7 children, and Tiki spent most of her formative years in Lima, Peru, growing up in Peru, and after graduating from the University of Maryland, spent time with Mike Wallace up in New York. That's awesome, working with Mike Wallace. And she also spent quite a few years in Spain, lived in Spain for a while, and she joined the Kennedy Center in 1978 and was happy to work there, I think you said, for 30 years. Todd Purdum. Todd is, we talk about journalists, we often call people a journalist, and truly this is a journalist. This is a person who joined as a copy boy, is that the right title?
Yes.
Okay. A copy boy for the New York Times maybe 30 years ago this year, 1982.
Yes.
What month did you join?
October 18th, 1982.
Okay, so 30 years ago joined the New York Times, no longer with the New York Times, but was with the New York Times for 23 years. And so, as I say, truly a journalist covering a variety of subjects during that time period. Following that time period was with the Los Angeles Times for a while, and also for a short period was a diplomatic correspondent and White House correspondent. And has now, you are with Vanity Fair.
Yes, for the past 6 years.
For the past 6 years. So we're really honored to have both these individuals with us. We just want to have a very informal conversation about this great man, this great American, through the eyes of 2 individuals who know a lot about this subject. So thank you for being here. We will, for those who have questions, we'd ask that you go to the microphone in the back here. I know, again, it's a small room. It's important to capture the questions with the microphone. And try to keep your questions fairly short if we could have you do that. And we'll try to wrap up maybe a little after 3 o'clock. Does that work for everyone? Okay. Take it away.
Good afternoon. I am Tiki Davies. You have to forgive my voice. I've had laryngitis, so Todd is going to be doing a lot of the reading that I think I'm going to be able to do. I'm one of John Paton Davies Jr.'s 7 children. And I'm very fortunate to have the generosity, support, presence of Vanity Fair's Todd, who wrote the introduction to the book. Todd and I thought we would read a couple of sections from China Han before we get started. He'll give you an overview of John Paton Davies and the time in which he lived. One of my father's habits when writing was to refer to himself and his family by their initials. So he was JPD, my mother was PGD, I was PFD, and so on. So instead of going through John Paton Davies, my father said, we'll just refer to him by his initials.
Thank you, Tiki. Well, I never had the good fortune to meet JPD in person, but I first made his acquaintance more than 30 years ago when I was an undergraduate at Princeton, and I came across a then recently republished book by Eric Sevareid, which was his memoir of his youth and service as a journalist in World War II, called Not So Wild a Dream. And in that book, he recounts the harrowing, wonderful tale in which he and Tiki's father were forced to bail out of their transport plane over Burma as they were going from India to China, along the border of Burma and India, where they fell into a tribe of headhunters. And they made it safely out, thanks in large part to the leadership of Tiki's father, and for that he was later awarded the Medal of Freedom by President Truman. And I just thought this was about the most exciting story I'd ever read, and her father tells his own version of it beautifully in this book. But it's really worthy of a Steven Spielberg or George Lucas movie, so maybe there's yet hope. My second exposure to him came right around the same time in a sadder context, and that was in a book by the New Yorker's E.J. Kahn called, fittingly, The China Hands. And it was the story of Tiki's father and his fellow Foreign Service officers who were punished in the McCarthy era for having been right about what would happen in China after World War II, for having predicted correctly that Mao Zedong and the communists would prevail over Chiang Kai-shek. And for that, they paid really the ultimate price of losing their jobs, losing their reputations, losing their livelihood. And that is, in fact, one of the reasons I was delighted when Tiki asked me if I would be willing to write this forward. I'd known her for years through her work at the Kennedy Center and mine at the New York Times, and I only much later made the connection between her and her father. So I was flattered and really gratified to have a chance to write the introduction to this book. Because John Paton Davies' story is basically a whirlwind who's who of the middle 50th years of the 20th century. He was born to American Baptist missionary parents in Sichuan, China, in the last year of Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, and he died in Asheville, North Carolina, in the aftermath of Bill Clinton's acquittal on impeachment charges. In between, he worked with, tangled with, or merely brushed up against a dizzying array of the most fascinating figures of his time, from Gandhi and Nehru to Franklin D. Roosevelt, General George Marshall, Wendell Willkie, Lord Mountbatten, and even Noel Coward and Frank Capra. But in this book, he's never the hero of his own life, however heroic his deeds sometimes were. Rather, he's the perpetually detached, wry, knowing observer with an elegant turn of phrase or a touch of whimsy always at his fingertips. On a hair-raising ride in the engineer's cab of an Indian mail train, he marvels that the front edge of the engine wasn't, quote, plastered with sirloins and spare ribs, so prevalent were wandering sacred cows along the track. Again and again, his judgments in these pages are uncannily prescient. He foresaw the difficulties for the Allied war effort of Britain's lingering imperialist posture. He understood, as he put it at one point before the end of the war, that the communists are in China to stay, and China's destiny is not Chiang's, but theirs. He realized as early as 1943, assessing the volatile prospects for post-war international relations, that we can now be assured of further war and revolution in our time, thereby envisioning what John F. Kennedy would later call the long twilight struggle of the Cold War. It was the great tragedy of his life, and the crux of this book, that in the most dangerous of those times, John Paton Davies' country was deprived of his services, not because he was ever determined to have been disloyal, but because after 9 successive internal security reviews, the State Department Loyalty Security Board at last concluded that he lacked judgment, discretion, and reliability, the very 3 characteristics he possessed in full measure. What he really lacked, of course, was conformity with the prevailing demands of American domestic politics in an age of fear. He was informed of this indictment by Secretary Dulles in November 1954, who promptly undermined the credibility of the findings by offering to provide a character reference should Davies ever need one. So he made an entire second career, which Tiki can tell you more about later. And he lived long enough to see his views vindicated and at least a measure of his reputation restored, and to hear his good old friend Eric Severide declare that while he had known a great number of men, he had never known one who seemed more the whole man, in all that a man should be, in modesty and thoughtfulness, in resourcefulness and steady strength of character, than Davies. He came to his career in the Foreign Service almost by accident. As a young man, fresh out of Columbia University, he'd applied for a job as a tutor to the teenage David Rockefeller. But he lost out, as Rockefeller's mother tells him in a charming telegram reprinted in the book, to someone who was more athletic and had a more developed interest in beetles, which was David's passion. So instead, he took a job as a dishwasher at a Dixie-style restaurant in Manhattan and applied for the Foreign Service. And in this passage, he tells what it was like to join the Foreign Service in 1932. He was staying with an aunt of his in Detroit, who seems like a marvelous person. She was very interested in art, and at one time or another in her life, she introduced him to Diego Rivera and Eros Saarinen, among other people, so he was leading a very cosmopolitan life for a young man. This is him in Detroit in January 1932. The Department of State notified me that I had passed the Foreign Service examination. In January 1932, I went abroad, a dime ferry ride across the river to the American consulate at Windsor, Ontario, for probationary duty as a Foreign Service officer. Unclassified, C, with a princely stipend of $2,500 a year. A year of in-job training, and I was transferred during the last days of the Hoover administration to Washington for 3 months' tutelage in the department. We were 15 novices, lectured to by Foreign Service and departmental officials on the various categories of consular work. At the end of the 3-month course, the instructors graded us. I received mixed appraisals. The immigration law and practice instructor wrote that I showed very little interest in the course, that my manners left much to be desired, and that I was the least promising of the officers in the class. I lacked a desire to show off to the best advantage. He concluded I would not entrust him with visa work. The international law instructor described me as mature and mentally keen. He should develop in the service if his initiative is challenged with responsibility. The lecturer in foreign commerce considered that my English in some respects leaves something to be desired, and perhaps that's because he'd been raised in China. And the consul general, who drilled us in documentation of merchandise and shipping and seamen, one Clarence E. Gauss, whom I'd later encounter as ambassador in China, granted me good appearance, courtesy, pleasing manners, but not particularly energetic, inquiring, attentive, or accurate. 13th in a class of 15. Appears to have judgment and common sense, the passport and citizenship instructor conceded, and to be older acting than his years, to be industrious and to have a sense of responsibility. He has the qualifications of a good officer, very serious disposition, courteous. With these spotty, contradictory credentials, I was assigned as vice consul to my first permanent post, Kunming, in the far southwestern mountains of China. Created as a career organization in 1924 by amalgamation of separate diplomatic and consular services, the Foreign Service was in the early 1930s still a personalized institution. It numbered some 700 officers, so one could come to know, at least by name and position, a high proportion of one's colleagues. While the system operated impartially and primarily on merit, with assignments and transfers made in accordance with the needs of the government, and promotion in accordance with performance, favoritism was not unknown. But it was no more and perhaps even less prevalent than in large business enterprises, and certainly far less than in state and municipal governments. Those who belonged to the Foreign Service tended to regard it as an elite corps. This was partly due to their status as representatives of the American government. As an apprentice vice consul at Windsor, I had received from the Canadian government an exequatur engraved on vellum, authorizing me to exercise my meager consular powers and issued over what purported to be the signature of George V, Rex Imperator. This autograph license from the King Emperor put me, in my own estimation, a notch above the boys across the river at Detroit City Hall. Another superficial factor contributing to a sense of elitism was the public conviction, fostered in novels and films, that Foreign Service life was glamorous, fraught with royal levees, deadly intrigue, and upper-crust philandering. For a few it may have been so, for most it was not. A very small minority gratified a need for feeling superior by dressing the part. The workaday costume of one of these diplomats, whom I later encountered at the Peking legation, was wing collar, striped trousers, black chancery jacket, and pince-nez, so that he looked like a reception clerk at a five-star hotel. Along with the costuming, there usually went a preoccupation with the social swim. In Washington, I had impressed upon me by one of these colleagues the importance to one's career of attending debutante balls and titillating dowagers at the celebrated club. But occasional petty vanities were not the real reason for regarding the Foreign Service as an elite corps. It had inherited from the old diplomatic service a compelling sense of public duty. The roots of this commitment, I suppose, reach back to a 19th century assumption that with privileged status went an obligation to serve the common weal, an attitude exemplified by the Adams family of Massachusetts. In such an atmosphere, it was assumed that a Foreign Service officer was a man of honor, and that in his relations with the public and his colleagues he would so conduct himself. On this assumption, the Foreign Service went about its business untormented by anxious preoccupation with security and discipline. The rare breaches of honor were usually dealt with quietly but firmly, as in a gentleman's club. The practice was that the senior officer at the mission or consulate, knowing personally everyone on his staff, dealt directly with the offender, and, in accordance with his judgment, would let the incident pass with a warning, enter a black mark on the offender's record, offer him an opportunity to resign, or recommend to the department his discharge. At the time I entered the Foreign Service, fingerprinting an officer was unheard of. When this precaution was some years later routinely put into effect, I felt a twinge of sadness, as if trust between friends had been spoiled. Bugging an officer's telephone and home, or testing his veracity by lie detector, were unknown and would have been considered an outrage. The greatest security of the early Foreign Service may well have lain in, along with the tradition of honor, the close association and familiarity of its members with one another, due to the small size of the staffs at posts abroad, and relatively speaking, of the Foreign Service in its entirety. A man's character and point of view became well, and with time, widely known within the service. With this understanding of one another, often went a wholesome tolerance of considerable nonconformity, even eccentricity.
So JPD started writing this book in the early 70s at the request of Viking Press. 20 years later, he'd written 26 chapters, but had stopped, not wanting to write about the unpleasantness of his last years in the Foreign Service. When he died in 1999, the family wanted to have the book published, and I took on the task a couple of years ago, and I was lucky to find Bill Finan at Penn Press, Todd, and Bruce Cummings from the University of Chicago, the epilogue. My task, to a large extent, involved retyping into the computer the carbon copy of the manuscript that my sister Megan gave me, still wrapped in the Lord & Taylor shopping bag. The section of his life that knocked my socks off as I typed, or rather typoed, my way through the manuscript, besides the dramatic accounts of parachuting into the Burma jungle and my mother's rather spectacular 3-month trip to join JPD in India, were 3. The jaunt he took through India, meeting the future leaders of that country, and they were adventures, as many of you SFO types may recollect. No phones, no cables, or any manner of being able to contact the people you wanted to see. Just showing up, calling card in hand, as the only identification. His descriptions of the extraordinary variety of India and its people are captivating. Here is his take on Nehru.
He arrives and says, "This contradictory, indecisive personality, then, was Gandhi's heir apparent. An upper-class Indian by birth, and an upper-class Englishman by education, Nehru was bicultural, an elegant, intellectual, ornamental aristocrat. Gandhi had overcome the anglicizing influence of his English education and re-Indianized himself, but not Nehru. I wondered if some less diluted Indian would not succeed the Mahatma, and I did not see in Nehru indications of force and command. Curiously, he was perhaps a greater international figure than national figure. Mrs. Naidu had commented that it was unfortunate that the United States was regarded as that in the United States, Nehru was regarded as the leader of the Congress Party. He was not. He was the theorist. Patel was the practical man of action. Ghulam Mohammed told me that he'd gone to school with Nehru in England. At the height of the campaign, back in India, to wear homespun and eschew English textiles, Mr. Mohammed returned one day to the quarters that he shared with Nehru and discovered that Jawaharlal had, in the transports of nationalist protest, consigned his own expensive English suits to a bonfire of imperialist fabrics. This annoyed Mohammed, whose nationalism was not of Nehru's burning kind. Years later, in 1942, Ghulam Mohammed said to me that Nehru was being spoiled by American adulation. He summed up Nehru as intellectually dishonest and a weakling. To the Western mind, he was more comprehensible than Gandhi, and even they, sorry, to the Western mind, Raja,
I can't pronounce that either.
another Indian politician, was more comprehensible than Gandhi and even Nehru. He was cool and matter of fact on a subject that was becoming for me a major concern regarding the future, an antagonistic division of the post-war world in two, with the United States and its European allies reestablished in their Asian colonies in one camp, and the non-white peoples of the world, opportunistically championed by the Soviet Union, in the other. We saw what happened with that.
His time spent in Yan'an at the Dixie Mission with Mao and Chow sharply contrasted with General Hurley's approach to that particular situation. This is the opening chapter, opening segment from chapter 18 about Hurley's visit to Yan'an.
He describes the arrival of FDR's special envoy to China, who later became ambassador, Patrick Hurley of Oklahoma. Hurley arrived unexpectedly at Vienna on the headquarters aircraft on November 7, 1944. He was nattily garbed in the uniform of a major general, a costume to which he was much attached. Looking over the welcoming throng, Hurley was moved to give forth with a Choctaw war whoop. The rustic Reds were unacquainted with the customs of American Aborigines, and so were mystified by the prolonged howl. However, they showed no signs of surprise, probably dismissing the ululation as only another manifestation of outlandish foreign behavior. The Choctaw war whoop was a part of Hurley's public personality. He exulted in his humble Oklahoman origins and the dialect, folk wisdom, and mannerisms of the frontier. His more flamboyant displays of mesquite, tomahawk, and six-shooter culture were reverse snobism, meant to defy and shock effete Easterners and Europeans, who, he suspected, looked down their noses at him. They were also a showman's bid for the attention and applause of paler sorts. While en route to Vienna, I had written to Hurley urging him to come to Dixie to form an independent, first-hand opinion of the communist leaders. My plea was superfluous during the time that he was supposed to be harmonizing relations between Chiang and General Stilwell, Joseph Stilwell, the commander of Allied forces in China, Burma, India. He also interested himself in harmonizing relations between Chiang and the communists. The first of these missions of reconciliation was specifically assigned to him by the president. I do not know of any document directing Hurley to essay the second. It would have been in character, however, had Hurley told the president before leaving for Chongqing that he would undertake to bring the two sides of China together. And it would have been wholly in the expansive, offhand Rooseveltian character to tell Hurley orally to go ahead. This would have been not unlike FDR's telling Stilwell and me that we were both ambassadors, political blather meant to send the auditor on his way feeling good. Unfortunately, those with distended egos, such as Hurley, Nelson, and Roosevelt's crass personal representative in India in 1942, Louis Johnson, took advantage of the president's flummery as a license to do as they pleased. Hurley arrived at Yan'an thinking that to bring Chiang's Kuomintang and the communists together was not much different from persuading Republicans and Democrats to accept bipartisanship in a time of national crisis. He brought with him a document defining a basis for agreement between the two sides, drafted by himself with assist from two of Chiang's subordinates. It provided for military unification, Chiang's supremacy in the government, legalization of the Communist Party, and government of the people, for the people, and by the people. Feeling that Hurley had his hopes much too high, I warned him shortly after his arrival against expecting the communists to agree what was acceptable to Chiang. I told him they would be hard bargainers. Hurley seemed surprised at what I said and resentful of my cautioning. He indicated that he wished to conduct negotiations with the communists by himself and that I should return to Chongqing on a plane departing the next day. I did so. He also took offense at a similar attempt by Teddy White to prepare him for, the great Time journalist, to prepare him for what he might encounter in his negotiations with the communists. In a written record of White's attempt to be helpful, Hurley twisted what White had told him and accused the correspondent of being against the mission with which I am charged. At the first of three meetings with the top communists, Hurley was taken aback when Mao explained the depth of differences between the Kuomintang government and the communists. What he heard was so far from what he fancied the situation in China to be that he explained that Mao's statements were similar to what China's enemies were saying. On the basis of this tactless sally, Hurley turned to his self-imposed mission and complained that it was asking too much to ask an outsider like him to do all the work in fixing an agreement. But if Mao would work with him, he later conceded, and they could get Chiang to work with them, then the three of them could unify China. The communists accepted Hurley's invitation to put forward their terms. These were, in essence, communist participation in the central government, in military as well as civil affairs, and a fair distribution of foreign aid. These claims seemed modest enough to Hurley. After all, Henry Stimson, Frank Knox, and he himself, all Republicans, were participating wholeheartedly in an administration headed by a Democrat. What he did not understand was the concept of a loyal opposition did not exist in China, and that Chiang's system of balancing off a variety of competing opportunists could not survive the introduction of Western democracy with its free-for-all popular participation, particularly when one of the competing forces would be a dynamic, proliferating, disciplined organization determined to destroy that system and seize power. Eager to contribute what he hoped would be a Magna Carta of a new China, Hurley embellished his expropriation from Lincoln. He now pledged the proposed national coalition government to establish freedom of conscience, speech, the press, and assembly, the right of the writ of habeas corpus, and many other good things, including freedom from fear and want. This inventory of political virtues and platitudes pleased the Reds mightily. Not that they would abide by them in the sense meant by Hurley. Rather, they could endorse them and leave it to an exultant Hurley to deliver the package to Chiang as an agreed Hurley communist position. The Generalissimo would, of course, reject the proposal, and in so doing appear to be what the communists always accused him of being, anti-democratic. Meanwhile, smug in their caves and on the side of Hurley's angels, the communists could entertain themselves with thoughts of Chiang's and Hurley's discomfiture.
And then the third is in Moscow. The birth of my sister Sasha in the Soviet hospital, the first all-American baby born in Soviet Russia. His explanation on how to survive a Soviet reception. The sense of nuance and intrigue that pervaded society. The short explosion of joy that followed the Soviets' announcement of the end of the war. It all adds up to a full-bodied illustration of what it must have been like to be in Moscow in that era. And at this same time, Jack Service was brought before the Loyalty Board. Here is part of JPD's account of his testifying on Service's behalf.
This was his friend and colleague who served with him in China, who was in some ways the John the Baptist, being accused of what he himself would soon be accused of. The board probed persistently Services in my briefing of the press. The genesis of the practice, I explained, was General Stilwell's recognition that in a democratic society, public opinion is necessary for the support of the war effort. He felt that the American people were being misled about many of the realities in China. He felt that this made his job more difficult. He indicated very clearly to me that he wished me to brief the press, and subsequently that other members of the State Department who were detailed to his staff should do likewise. Stillwell's instructions to me were oral. Later in my testimony, I indicated that I transmitted orally to Service the General's wishes in this regard. In response to a question from the chairman regarding our relations with the press, I referred to the restraints we imposed upon ourselves in filling in newsmen. We exercised our individual judgments as to what might properly be revealed. Such matters as directives and policy guidance from the State and War Departments should not be divulged. But the material which was repertorial about the local situations, political, social, economic, those we felt were grist for the press mill to provide an enlightened American public. Answering further questions, I made a distinction between two types of briefing. One was information provided for background, not attributable to the briefing officials or the government. A second was for attribution, in which the releasing source might be revealed. This latter type included communiques and official press releases issued by military press officers. Such information as we did give, I testified, was in all instances given for background. This led to the matter of classification. Some documents were classified confidential or secret only to protect the source, the content. The chairman asked whether I might have felt free to give such information. I indicated that I might have, provided the source was not compromised. A prime example of classification to protect a source was my designation of top secret to the Moscow embassy's telegrams reporting indiscreet comments by a Maxim Litvinov. This was a wonderful thing in which the CBS journalist Richard C. Hodlin had obtained an interview with Litvinov, and John Paton Davies correctly understood that if these comments became public, it would be a disaster. So he sent them back to Washington by secret cable, and Richard C. Hodlin never breathed a word to CBS. I don't think that would happen today. There was, I observed, a tendency to grossly overclassify. No, I too overclassified. It was epidemic. The chairman asked if, after I classified one of my reports confidential or secret, I would later feel free to reveal the information so classified. I answered, that would depend entirely on my judgment of the circumstance.
I will tell you the hardest part for me was to type the chapters that involved General Hurley and the approaching hysteria. I'd have to stop and take a walk around the block before I could come back to it. Like Hamlet or O'Neill's Iceman Cometh, no matter how well you know the play, you dread the outcome. The tale of the 9 security hearings was not one he wanted to tell, and growing up in Lima after 1954, that part of his life was not something he or my mother dwelled on. He was not someone who spent his time looking back and mourning the past. I thought you might like to hear the letter my mother wrote to a close friend of hers the days after my father was fired.
And it's significant that he was given the chance to resign quietly, keep his pension, keep his future employment prospects, and he chose to be fired instead because he did not want to acknowledge any wrongdoing, and he took his chances. And this is the letter that Tiki's mother wrote to her friend Helen Moody from Lima, November 11th, 1954. Dearest Helen, forgive this scratch paper, but I have put off writing a note until I can find something decent. Someone will telephone, call, or send me notes, and another day will be gone without a word to you. I have 2 letters from you. The second one came yesterday. I can't tell you how much they mean to me. There are times in life, as in the comic strip Urchin used to say, when a fellow needs a friend, and this is one of them. The only way that I can describe what this thing is like is someone you love very much has been ill a long time and is in pain. You know he has to die. But yet when the death comes, it is a shock, causes grief, and strangely surprise. Then after a day or two, the grief is followed by a deep sense of peace and gratitude that the uncertainty is over, and that pain can no longer pierce your loved one. That's it in a nutshell. Everyone is being kind, more than kind. The whole embassy rallied round from top to bottom, ditto the diplomatic corps, the American business community and our Peruvian friends. So I do not lack for anything except a bit of time to myself. The children are fine, as am I. I sleep like a top. I had an outbreak of nervous highs the day after the news broke, but that cleared up in no time. I was informed in the middle of a dinner party by the ambassador telephoning. He'd gotten it from the local press. I went back, finished dinner, and went home after coffee. I can safely say that I don't think there was very much wrong with my nerve. But, and I must admit it to you, I've had some bad moments. They've all come from the kindness of others. It is love that brings tears, not hate. Now we're quietly waiting to find out what the future holds. John is job hunting. He's had one offer that I know of. He has some wonderful ideas, but they all involve a good deal of capital. Who knows that we make our future here in Peru? It is certainly a land of business opportunity, and John is ace high here. So we shall see. Meanwhile, the children will continue to go to school. The academic year is finished on December 22nd, I believe, so we will see that through. I expect to be here until that time, no matter what happens. In the meantime, I'm a free citizen, and I can say if I wish what I've been thinking for 10 years, that the Secretary of State, incumbent, is a bloody bastard. I am also prepared to back up this point of view with incidents that have nothing to do with John or the Foreign Service. I'm delighted that you're beginning to feel full of pep again. We are in the midst of a tremendous bullfight season, which keeps my interests engaged. The last fight, unhappily, is on Sunday. Don't worry about me. If I'm not on top, I'm certainly on the way there. And I'm sure John is too. Incidentally, they gave John a chance to resign, urged him to, and then they would cover up the whole thing. He preferred to be fired. At least we can live with ourselves, which is more than some great lay churchman can. Don't worry, I'm not bitter. But the only thing final in life is death, and I've got my little list just in case. Love, 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 Patricia.
But there was no bitterness in either JPD or PGD. The only way we learned about this time of madness was to go into his library office and look at the old news clippings and check in the indexes of books for his name. It wasn't as though it was forbidden to talk about that time. There was just too much else going on in the present to afford it any attention. But all of us were hugely proud of JPD. We felt he was a hero of towering strength. One of the kids in my 7th grade class in Peru, in fact, made fun of me for starting so many of my sentences with "my father said." Truthfully, I didn't even know I was doing that. Lima was a happy place for us to grow up during the almost dozen years we were there. Family trips to the beach on a Sunday, a safe, noisy daily life, not much money, but never a sense of poverty, and much, much love. The only thing my siblings and I shared was a sense of apartness, knowing that we were somehow different from all the other American children, expats amongst expats. After being fired by Secretary of State John Foster Dulles in November of '54, JPD needed to find a job. He knew that the employment possibilities in the United States would be scarce due to the continuing hysteria brought on by McCarthyism, and he and our mother felt that Peru, his last Foreign Service assignment, was a safe, civilized, and relatively inexpensive place for them and their children. He explored many avenues, including starting a soup factory. JPD settled on establishing a furniture factory. With no previous experience, he stocked up on design and art books and set forth to create a company called Estilo, which means style in Spanish. After some years of making replicas of traditional furniture, he started creating his own designs using exotic Peruvian woods. The designs were both gorgeous and extraordinary, so much so that in 1962, he won awards for his designs from the American Institute of Interior Designers. In the late 50s, he proceeded to explore the pre-Columbian designs found in ancient textiles and pottery of the pre-Incan and Incan Empire. He found the astonishingly modern representation of the flora and fauna of South America seen in these ancient artifacts made an easy translation into massive wood blocks and then into intriguing prints. He called the final print a monoprint because the process he used to create them never allowed for an exact copy. The prints often had various layers of color, sometimes applied sparingly and sometimes with a generous hand. In fact, there is an exhibit currently at Strathmore Hall in Bethesda entitled A Singular Vision, the art and words of John Paton Davies, Jr., with some of these monoprints. The exhibit will be there until April 14th. JPD was clear-sighted, unsentimental, amazingly prescient in his take on world events, loyal, loving, and very funny. Thank you. And I think take any questions if anybody has questions.
I tell you what, I'm going to use some discretion here. I'm going to walk this microphone around. There also is that microphone over there if those on this side wish to use it. Ma'am?
Hi, I'm Sharon Kotak. I have a quick comment rather than a question. I was chief of the Privacy Act staff back in the 1970s, and your father, John Paton Davies, was one of our early requesters. He was not the only China hand who was a requester, but anyway, our little staff, there were only like 4 of us at the time, were actually enchanted by him. And we were so enchanted by him, we actually took him out to lunch. And of course, we took him through what is now the Magic Gourd. I don't know if it was the Magic Gourd at the time. But I remember he referred to us as, we would have our eyes look heavenward when he would ask about the status of his documents, because all we were doing was trying to process the request. We weren't actually reviewing the documents, so we had no control over how long it was taking to get his documents. But he also told us a story about that he made when he was a cabinet maker. He had actually submitted it for a prize, and as soon as they found out that it was he, John Paton Davies, the China hand, they actually took the prize away from him. So that might have been another prize as well. But anyway, it's such a delight. I have to admit, it was kind of the highlight of our Privacy Act years, was servicing your father.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. I know that he had, he spent a good deal of time trying to get that information. I think it was in Kansas, God knows where, it was somewhere at Ellendon. And he told him he had something like an entire wall of file cabinets with his stuff in it. This has gone off. I don't know if it's on there. But what was horrifying that I had mentioned to Todd is that often spent, even when he got the various number of the documents, the people who had accused him were still blacked out, so that he even then in the 70s never knew who had charged him with these things. Sorry.
Hello. My name's Tony Piver, and it's an interesting coincidence. I just finished rereading David Halberstam's book, The Best and the Brightest, and it turns out one of the few characters that really comes out very well in that book is your father. And I was just curious if your father had spoken to you, or if you knew of the interviews that Mr. Halberstam would have conducted for that book, or if he had given you an impression of what was his impression of that work, because even though it's not about him, there's almost an entire chapter devoted to him, and that's what got me interested in coming here today.
Oh, I'm glad you did. I think what's interesting about that is when Halberstam first wrote it, the portion about my father was much smaller, and as he went to do the 2nd, 5th, or 18th printing, whatever it was, he decided to expand that particular section into a chapter, and indeed, when I was working for Mike Wallace in New York for his little radio show called Mike Wallace at Large, he called me and asked me for an interview to talk about that time. Obviously, he had talked to Father, and I think he also talked to another one of my sisters. But I will tell you one wonderful thing about David Halberstam. When my father was getting, he had macular degeneration and a lot of other physical complications towards the end of his life, I wrote Mr. Halberstam a letter because I wanted to make sure that there was, to quote Arthur Miller, attention paid to him when he died. And Halberstam, and I thought maybe he might be able to write something. Well, what he did was he went and he talked to Arthur Gell, who made sure that he obit. It was an entire page in the New York Times, the 23rd of December of 1999, and I know I owe that to him.
It should be noted, perhaps for the record, that the instrument, as Tiki pointed out just a while ago, the State Department never actually apologized to her father. But in 1969, at the very end of the Johnson administration, it did restore his top secret security clearance as a way of acknowledging that, he was not a loyalty risk. And in some period after that, there were amends that were attempted to be made. I believe it was this organization that had a luncheon for several of the China hands. And at that time, Tiki's family was living in Malaga, Spain. And the last line of Jack Kahn's book, The China Hands, is that John Paton Davies did not come because he thought, not because he was not very grateful, but because he thought it would have been a long way to go for lunch.
He was funny.
I'm very pleased to be able to join you on this occasion. I married a China hand, and I think JPD is sort of the epitome of what a real China hand is. I'm looking forward to reading the book. My question has to do with overclassification. In my period from 50 to 83, I overclassified as much as anybody. And I was wondering whether this practice made it difficult for Mr. Davies to defend himself.
I think he talks about that again later in the book, if I remember right. Or maybe it's also Bruce Cummings that talks about it. But one of the things that obviously has made everything so uneasy was there was no real official way to decide what was top secret, what wasn't. And I think at one point he says that there are clerks that were saying things were top secret. There was no rhyme or reason to any of that. So I am sure that certainly made things more difficult. But Todd, you probably...
Well, he talked, there's an amusing sidelight. It talks about one point in the early part of World War II, someone went to the India file in the State Department, and the only thing that tumbled out was an old National Geographic map of India stamped top secret. But Senator Moynihan of New York, the late Senator Moynihan, wrote wonderfully, he wrote a whole book about the called secrecy, about the huge tendency to overclassify. And I believe it was about 5 or 6 years ago, the archives did an internal study, and they found not only that vast numbers of documents had been unnecessarily classified, but that in response to when certain FOIA requests would come in, the agencies themselves, notably the CIA, would go back and pull from the open shelves documents that tended to point toward the source of information and retroactively classify them solely in response to the request for a document that was open, and because they wanted to obscure the source of the information. And this was, in this internal audit found that this was just unconscionable. So I think it's a perpetual battle, and probably a losing one. And I think the particular insidious nature of the witch hunts that Tiki's father was a victim of was that you did not see your accusers, you did not know them, and it was all this raw FBI files and other information that was full of hearsay and what Walter Winchell used to call insinuendo, and it was almost impossible to combat it. So I assume it had to have made defense more difficult.
One last thing about that is that when he died, he had wanted his papers to go to the Truman Library. So I had contacted them, and they were lovely about it, and they said they only wanted, and of course now I regret sending them so much stuff, but They only wanted information that was specifically public and specifically had to do with policy and the State Department of Government. So, but I wasn't to ship it to them, I was to ship it to the National Archives here in Washington. So I sent off 7 or 8 or 10 boxes, I don't remember now. And when I took this on some 3 years ago, I was stunned to find that the Truman Library still didn't have any of the papers. They were still at the National Archives, being vetted. 60 years ago. It seemed a little absurd to me.
Any additional questions? We thought they were approaching.
Yeah.
Sir, did you have a question?
Maybe that was a question.
David Nichols, I'm in the Office of the Historian at the State Department. I'm curious to what extent Mr. Davies maintained his connections with China and how the opening to China in the 70s, he must have taken interest in that if he had continuing connection.
He took interest in world events. He never, that was something, I was going to say, he didn't change careers, he just expanded. It's much more encompassing. He listened to when we were in Peru, he listened to the BBC and the Voice of America every night, on our big old phone radio. I think certainly he didn't get any overtures from the American government to have any thoughts on the matter. And nor, interestingly enough, did he from the Chinese government. But what had happened over a period of time, obviously, is there were pilgrims, lack of a better word, coming up the mountain. They lived on Tout Mountain Road in Asheville, coming to want to do interviews, to do television interviews, to work on dissertations. So there was this whole huge kind of small industry having to do with wanting to know the China hands thought and how they perceived what had happened. But he was certainly fascinated by the whole.
But he never again went to China after 1944, right?
Yes, the letter from Joan. He got a letter from Joan Lai we were going to read, but it's just one thing too many, which is so sweet. Joan Lai's asking him for like magazines and books. He's finished reading. This is horrible.
Yes.
Bring that around.
This takes a little bit of courage. In 1931 and to 1935, my father, mother, and I spent in Peking because my father was with the Institute of Current World Affairs, and he was their first China fellow. He went with he was away a great deal because his primary interest was Manchukuo and what on earth the Japanese were doing there. And also he went to Mongolia, but he went with, that's when the League of Nations, he went with the League at Lytton's request. I remember when they were in Peking before they went, that Lytton wasn't well, and so my father went to the hospital and took some material that was dictated to him. So Lytton asked my father to go to the League with him, and he did. This was 1932 to 33. My father would have gone through all I'm hearing if he hadn't passed on. A little while after we got back, he became ill. He was working at the Tariff Commission, and he passed on when I was in high school. But I just wanted you to know that I'm very much attached to this book, and very interested I really want to study it and put it with all my other material that I'm putting back to my family, putting my family back together again with all this wonderful material. because my little brother didn't make it. He became ill just 2 weeks before we left, and he's buried in China.
I think she cut.
Hey,
Hello, Sarah.
I have a question about your father's relationship to China after 1954. Did he continue to be interested in it? Did he read in it? Or did he just say, okay, that was then and now my design side is coming out? I mean, it seems like the design part of his life was sort of a wonderful opportunity that may have never happened if he'd been fired. Not that it was a good thing he got fired, but I was wondering how much he integrated those two lives.
Very much so. In fact, he ended up writing columns. He wrote them in English, and they were translated for Purdum, which was Pedro Beltran's newspaper. It was the liberal newspaper and considered the best newspaper in South America. And so he did a daily column, a weekly column for them for a number of years. And he would write for the New York Times Magazine and Harper's and wherever he could get somebody who wanted him to write something. So it was still, the world in its greatness was still very, very, very important. In fact, when I told him that I wanted to get involved in the performing arts, he was totally puzzled. He said, "Why would you want to do that? That isn't half as interesting as what goes on in the outside world." He said it has a beginning, middle, and end.
Question about, although the State Department didn't really apologize in the way that they should have for this, was there any attempt to restore his pension rights or restitute for this terrible injustice?
Yes, they gave him he started the pension once I think it was shortly after 1969, and they also gave him insurance, which of course was a very big deal. So we obviously were very grateful for that.
Well, he had it coming.
Well.
Thank you.
Any additional questions, comments?
I have one.
Yes?
I have, if anybody's wondered what became of my mother. She was a librarian and a teacher. They had met in Yokohama in 22. Thank goodness there was no email. We had these marvelous pictures and letters and all of that kind of thing. But I'm a graduate of Montgomery Blair High School, and she lied to the Navy about my age and joined the Waves and went to San Francisco, and she was in the Office of censorship, so that when the gentlemen who were up at the top of the mark would have one sheet and she would have the same sheet, and they knew that if they so much as deviated one word, she would cut them off. And I always say that that was great for a librarian, quiet you.
And all else is, don't forget, I have the chop here if anybody wants to get their book chopped. I'm not as, my husband generally does these in New York, so I'm not quite as good as he is at it, but I'll try to do a reasonable job.
Any additional questions or comments, thoughts? All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's give them a round of applause. And what we'll do for book signing and that sort of thing, let's do it over here at this table.
That's right.
But let me really thank the two of you. Thank you very much. Such a nice balance of a very poignant, loving tribute to your father, in addition to the professional retrospective of his life. And as I said at the outset, really a man of integrity, and encourage all of you to purchase the book and to honor his memory. And thank you for being here, both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.